As I take my first steps, I already know that this is going to be my most challenging hike into history. And right off the bat, what's striking me is how the weight of what I'm carrying is distributed in a completely different way than, say, even a crusading knight would be. Most soldiers have things on their backs in a pack or slung across their shoulders. A Roman, like I'm portraying right now, is actually carrying most of their gear in a very unique T-shaped pole that they've got slung across their right shoulder. And in a way it's efficient because you tie it together with your pilum, your spear, and some of your entrenching equipment, and then most of your gear hangs off the crossbeams. But what's interesting is that all that weight, it's on your shoulder, which is a little bit different than, say, a backpack, and it's a little bit higher. So that's definitely causing me some discomfort right now. So I found a handy tree here to show you a little bit of this very unique Roman cross-shaped carrying apparatus that they use instead of a backpack. So you notice that we have some cooking equipment, some pots and pans. You notice that we have a wool cloak, a scutum, that's a little bit too warm to be wearing now, so it's rolled up and it's on one of the cross pieces. We have a leather satchel, it's called sacina, and inside of it is some of my personal items, and we'll take a look at those a little bit later. And then kind of tied to it all, we've got like a cooking tripod and a pilum. And Roman soldiers on the march would actually have had a little bit more weight. They would have had some pre-cut stakes to erect fortifications at the end of the march, and they would have had some entrenching tools. They might have had a delabra, a Roman pickaxe, attached to it as well. So this is actually kind of a light version of what they would have been carrying. And never forget, I'm also carrying chainmail armor, sword, dagger, and a shield. So the weight is actually pretty extreme. You know, one of the first things you think about when you think about the Romans is uniformity. You know, if you ever see them in films, they're always juxtaposed against a barbarian army that's all wearing mismatched armor, furs and skins. And then you have the Romans in perfect discipline in a fighting line and perfect matched armor. They're interchangeable ancient world warriors. And that's certainly the impression we get from watching films and reading books of the time period. But when you go back to the original sources, what you realize is that's actually probably not quite the case for a lot of Roman history, especially the Republican part of Roman history. When Rome was a republic, its army, for the most part, were citizen soldiers. They bought their own arms and armor, and they brought it with them into battle. So one person might be wearing armor and arms that had been handed down generation to generation, and another person might have had new bought armor. And the idea that it was all uniform is actually maybe a little bit far-fetched. So they might have been fairly mismatched during the Republican times. During the late Republican period, a politician and general named Gaius Marius rose to power, and he really began the transformation of the Roman army from a citizen army into a professional army. And when that happens, you start seeing gear and uniform and equipment start to standardize because of what is called the Marian reforms. So as I'm walking, you know, what I'm noticing most is that this is exhausting. More so than, say, a dismounted knight during the Crusades, or say a World War II soldier, or someone fighting in the American Civil War. The equipment that I'm carrying, the armor, the way I'm carrying it, just seems to me to be heavier and harder to deal with than anything I've done before. And it starts to make sense because after the reforms of Gaius Marius that kind of turned the Roman army into a professional army, his soldiers were kind of derisively known as Marius's mules, because he kind of set this expectation that they would be able to march further, carrying more weight, and then build a fortified camp every night on the march. He kind of set that expectation that really didn't go away for 150 years. Whew. You know, I've worn armor of many kinds before. And the Roman armor during the Republican period, which is what I'm wearing now, is both more convenient and also kind of least expected. What I mean by that is when you picture Rome and Roman soldiers, you're not picturing what I'm wearing now, which is this short chainmail shirt with kind of this shoulder doubling, this kind of golden, essentially pot on my head. You're not picturing that. What you're probably picturing is the segmented armor from the later Roman Empire period. Is it convenient? You know, there is a convenience to it. You know, especially with the belts I've got strapped on. It distributes the weight a little evenly. And you notice that it's a short sleeve garment, so I can kind of swing my arms, I can swing a sword. You know, it's certainly not as soul crushing as, say, the full chainmail hauberk and chainmail leggings of a crusading knight, for instance. At the same time, it's hard to really compare the two because I'm so exhausted from carrying this cross-shaped pack on my back. You know, Marius's mules never had to march while holding a camera. So, you know what? Take that, Republican Roman soldier. I got you beat. Not really. There is, I cannot lie, this hike into history so far has been exhausting. And it's funny how you can fixate on one thing. The armor, the weaponry, the shoes, none of that is actually bothering me. What's bothering me is this very unique way of the Romans had of carrying gear. This cross piece with all this gear hanging from it. I really am having a hard time understanding the Roman penchant for doing this, where the benefit is. And I suppose one of them is the Romans were carrying very heavy gear. You know, they were carrying pre-made stakes for fortifications. They were carrying not only camping and cooking gear, but entrenching gear. And maybe this was the only way to really carry big, bulky items like that. That would make some sense to me. But right now, whew, it's tough. You know, I'll say this about the Roman helmet, is you can see. They are definitely focused on you being able to see. So unlike later helmets of different time periods, or say like the Spartan helmet of generations before, I have a good field of vision. So the most commonly recognized weapon of a Roman soldier he wore on his right hip, and that is the gladius. Gladius is just a word for sword in Latin. It's also the term where we get the word gladiator from, someone who uses a sword. This particular gladius, you notice the blade shape is from the Republican period. Later on, rather than this leafing, it would become kind of straighter rather than this broadening at the edge. The idea of the gladius, if you've ever seen a sword fight with a gladius in Hollywood films, that is about as Hollywood movie magic as you get, because these were not meant to have a sword fight. You know, these were meant for a very simple task, which was stabbing. This was meant for someone to be able to hide behind a shield and stab over the shield or stab under the shield. And that's about what this was meant for. A secondary weapon of a Roman soldier is a fighting dagger, a pugil. This weapon changed very little throughout the Roman period. Could be used in a fight, but also as any kind of entrenching tool or a utility knife of any kind. Roman wore this on their left hip. And when you read in Shakespeare about Julius Caesar and the Roman senators approaching them with knives drawn, the Roman pugil is what they were using. So that actually gives a little bit better visual of that scene out of Shakespeare. The shield you see behind me is a scutum. During the Republican period, they would have been oval, as this one is, slightly curved. Mine is actually quite a bit smaller than a Republican Roman soldier would have carried. The design on the shield is actually familiar, I would think, for anyone who has ever seen any kind of Roman history film. But what's funny is that design, as far as we know, varied from legion to legion and time to time. The reason that we always see this design is because one of the few depictions we have of Roman shields comes from Trajan's Column in Rome, where Roman soldiers are depicted in detail. And this is the most common design on those shields. So this is basically the design that by default, people think that this is the design Roman soldiers had on all their shields. And that's not true, but that is certainly what you will see depicted in films from Hollywood. One item we don't really talk about on these hikes is the tunic, the shirt, whatever the undergarment is. For the Romans, this tunic was actually about knee length or even calf length, and then you cinched it up with a belt. And essentially that was what you wore. You don't really see Romans wearing pants that often, although they would wear breeches or wool trousers in frigid or cold temperatures because they weren't silly. But for the most part, they wore a tunic that was cinched at a very long tunic that was cinched at the waist. And that's what I'm here in camp. I've kind of shed the armor, and now I'm just in this kind of wool, kind of shapeless tunic. And I will say it's incredibly comfortable, unlike most wool garments I've worn, because it is so shapeless, because it has such volume. It's not very clingy, and it's not very uncomfortable. The concept of an energy drink is not new. The Romans had a version of it called Pasca. And Pasca had the virtue of also being cheap. So you hear tale of it as what people drank when they couldn't get wine. It had the added benefit of apparently being quite filling, but also providing energy on the march. And Pasca was essentially vinegar and water and some honey. And I've got some Pasca here in this kind of kiln-fired canteen. So let's see what Pasca is all about. Okay. Wow. Okay. So you can definitely taste the vinegar. The honey gives it a little bit of sweetness. There is a refreshing aspect to this. Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, you never know if you're getting the vinegar to water to honey ratio right, because we just don't know. That's interesting. I can see a Roman soldier having some Pasca, and that being a little bit like ancient world Gatorade. Fascinating. These Roman sandals that I'm wearing, they're hobnailed on the bottom. so they have good grip. And I'm wearing them with these very heavy wool socks, which, when you look at the depictions of Roman soldiers on Trajan's column, that's how they were worn. And between the socks, I suppose the design of the sandal, I'm marching along quite comfortably here. So score 1 for the Roman Republic, I suppose.